Hello everyone and welcome to Lecture 2 for Strategic Management. What we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of external analysis, and in particular we're going to talk about how we analyse the factors in the broad or macro environment and think about how these factors might impact upon a business. So you remember in Lecture 1 I talked about there being two models of strategic analysis. The resource-based view of the firm and the industrial organisational model. And in this lecture and the lecture next week, we're going to look at that industrial organisation model, which deals specifically with the external part of strategic analysis. Now, to prepare for this lecture and to support the learning in this lecture, you should have a look at the early parts of Chapter 2 of the recommended text. In that chapter they talk at length about factors in the general environment and how they might impact upon business. So you'll remember in the lecture I introduced this document to you, this figure here. And this is a figure that summarises the strategic management process. So this is very much the process by which an organisation goes about developing a clear set of strategies for the future, and then how they go about implementing or putting into action those different strategies. So if you can see it by looking at this figure, you can see up in the top left hand corner there, the first part of the strategy process is about dealing with the inputs into your strategy. And there are two parts of this process. There's external analysis and there's internal analysis. So what we'll do in week 2 and week 3 is we'll look at the external factors. So we'll talk a bit about the broad environment, which is what we'll talk about today. And next week we'll talk about the industry environment, the competitor environment and the customer environment and how these impact upon strategy. In week 4 we'll look at the internal environment, and so we'll talk about the internal factors within the organisation that impact upon an organisation's strategy. So once we've finished these first 4 lectures, we'll have all the information we need to develop the inputs into an organisation's future strategy. So what are we going to talk about in this lecture? So this lecture is really focused on external analysis, on understanding the factors that impact upon a strategy of an organisation but reside outside of the organisation. So understanding the impact of a firm's external environment. So by the end of this lecture you should be able to describe what the external environment means. When we talk about the external environment and strategy, what is it that organisations are looking at? You should also be able to describe and define the different trends or factors that make up the general environment in a particular industry. So you should be able to identify what these industry factors look like. You should be able to discuss the activities involved in environmental analysis. So how is it that an organisation is able to analyse the external environment and get a good sense of what's happening in that environment? And again, describe some of the general trends that are impacting upon business. So what I'm going to do is offer you some broad categories of change or trends that are happening in the business environment, and get you thinking about what some of those trends might be and how they might impact upon a business's operations. So you'll remember in the first lecture I introduced the IO model, or the industrial organisation model. So this is a model of understanding industry and competition that looks outside of the organisation. And the IO model originally was developed in the field of economics. In fact, it's a branch of economic study that looks at the organisation and structure of industries and how those industries impact upon an organisation's performance. So the IO model tells us that it's really the industry in which a firm competes that has the strongest influence on a firm's performance. So the performance and the success or failure that an individual organisation experiences is really driven by things that exist outside the organisation. So say you're a small bank operating here in Australia in the lead up to the global financial crisis. If during the global financial crisis you went out of business because suddenly you weren't able to gain access to liquid cash in the financial sector because bigger banks were no longer lending to smaller banks, then that would be an example of an external factor that has significantly impacted on your performance and probably has led to you as an organisation no longer being in business. So when an organisation is developing its strategy from an IO perspective, it starts by looking outside the organisation to try and understand what are the factors that are present in the general environment, in our industry, in our competitive environment, with our customers, and how are these factors likely to impact on our strategy and our performance. And under the IO model, it is strongly believed that the performance of an individual business is linked to a couple of key things. So the first thing would be economies of scale. Some organisations are able to succeed because they're simply so large and have such a large share of the market that this market share enables them to see off any competitive threats. If you think about large web-based companies, so think about Facebook, for example, in the social media space. Facebook currently has over 1 billion users. That's a large percentage of the world's population is using that social media site. And so because of that scale of operations, because they're offering services to such a broad market, that means that they're able to be very successful and to see off competition because they have such a large scope of operations. The same thing happens in manufacturers. Many manufacturing businesses succeed because of the economy of scale they're able to achieve by producing en masse. So if you think about any of the large car companies, someone like Ford or Volkswagen, by having standardised models that they produce and sell on a global basis, they're able to reduce their cost per unit with the standardisation that they achieve. And because they're selling such a large volume, the unit cost for each of those volumes is significantly reduced. A second factor outside the organisation that will impact on our overall performance are barriers to market entry. It's not always easy for an organisation to get established and to set up in a particular competitive marketplace. And sometimes there are real barriers. It could be a geographical barrier, for example. Markets might be a long way away from your base of operations, and so as a result it's difficult for you to set up and compete in that industry. Or there might be government barriers. If you think about China, for example, foreign businesses looking to do business in China are only allowed to operate there if they meet certain government regulations. For example, they have to have a 50% joint venture partner with a partnership with a Chinese company. So these factors prevent other companies from coming into that marketplace and act as a barrier to new competition and a barrier to organisations having to develop a new strategy to compete effectively. Another determinant of a firm's performance is the level of diversification they have. Diversification tells us how many markets or product categories a business actually competes in. So the more diversified an organisation is, the more industries or markets that they compete in, the better able they are to see off competitive threats in any one of those markets. Say a market suddenly becomes unproductive, you can stop competing in that market and concentrate your efforts in other product categories. IBM have done this, where they stopped dealing with personal computing and said, look, it's no longer profitable for us to compete and operate in the personal computing marketplace, so we'll leave that marketplace and we'll focus on business services. Firm performance can also be influenced by the degree of product differentiation that we see in the marketplace. If you're competing in a market where products are highly standardised, so say you're selling a commodity item like coal or gold, then it's really difficult for you to compete effectively because your product is not substantially different from other products in the market. Other markets, on the other hand, tend to have high degrees of product differentiation. So if you think about the fashion marketplace, the marketplace for clothing, what we see is that consumers have a preference for differentiated products, which enable organisations to find niches within those markets so they can compete more effectively. So if we think about a couple of clothing retailers, if we think about Zara, Country Road and Billabong, each of those three companies have been able to find niches in the market, sets of consumers who buy their differentiated product over other competing products. And the final thing that might be outside the firm that could impact upon our performance is the degree of concentration of firms in the industry. If the firm is made up of lots of small firms who are all evenly balanced, competing with each other, then what we tend to see is that there's pretty fierce competition between those organisations in the market. However, if we have a marketplace where you have one or two large providers who dominate large sectors of the economy, we tend to see a reduction in competition, and so therefore it's harder for new firms to get established because they're having to compete against these big monolithic organisations. Again, if we think about social media platforms in the West, we would see someone like Facebook as being it's almost like a monopoly player, although not quite, in the social media landscape. And again, as we talked about in Lecture 1, we said that the IO model makes four key assumptions about the external world and the impacts it has upon strategy. So the first assumption it says is that the external environment imposes pressures and constraints that determine the strategies that we as an organisation can adopt that will lead us to above average returns. So it's not the will of the organisation or the resources that we possess that determines what our strategy should be. It's these environmental factors, these things that sit outside the organisation, that will have an influence on what the strategy might look like. The second thing that the IO model says is that most firms competing in an industry have similar resource profiles. So, okay, when you think about the resources and capabilities of these firms, they all look very similar. And as a result, they all pursue very similar strategies. Now, this assumption is a little bit problematic because it's a very abstract assumption. It's an assumption that really does come out of straight economic theory that assumes that firms are like a black box, that what happens inside that black box is very consistent. And this is not really the case in reality. We know that when we look at Coles versus Woolworths, or when we look at Jetstar versus Singapore Airlines, we see that these firms actually don't have the same sorts of resources, and they actually do pursue slightly different strategies to attract customers to their organisation. The third assumption that the IO model makes is that resources needed to implement strategies are very mobile. That while a firm might control a resource, they only control it for a short period of time, and that resources can move easily within marketplaces to areas where they're needed the most. And so, again, if you're thinking about a resource strategy, a business strategy that's based on people as a resource, the assumption of the IO model would be that a new organisation looking to compete in that market could simply go out and buy the talent that they need to succeed. The fourth assumption of the IO model is that decisions in the organisation are made on a rational basis and are always focused on achieving the best interest or best outcomes for the organisation. So this is the classic economic assumption of profit maximisation, that the job of a business is to make maximum profit. Now again, this is not always true in reality. We know that a lot of organisations pursue social goals or community-based goals that are at odds with the profit-making goal. But overall, we see that from an IO perspective, these four factors have a big influence on strategy. And again, I ran you through this model and basically talked about the process by which we would develop a strategy from an IO perspective. So under the industrial organisational model, the starting point is with external analysis. And external analysis is focused on three key areas. We look at the general or broad environment. Sometimes, for example, in Introduction to Management, it might be referred to as the macro environment. The second thing we look at is the industry environment, so the direct industry in which we compete. And when we look at the industry, we're talking about the bargaining power of the buyer or the suppliers, the threat of new entrants, and how these factors might impact on strategy. And the third thing we do is look at the competitor environment. And so we try and make a decision as to what the nature of competition is within the industry and what are the main competitive threats. And then out of that comes a determination of how attractive an industry might be for our organisation to compete in. So really those first couple of steps are what we're going to be talking about this week and next week. So this week we're talking about that first part of external analysis, which is the general environment. Next week we'll talk about analysing the industry and talk about analysing competitors. And then at the end of that we'll be able to make a determination about which industries are most attractive for organisations to compete in. Once you've worked out how attractive the industry is, you can then move into the process of strategy formulation, so determining what your business level or corporate level strategies may well be for the organisation. We then determine the assets and skills that we might need, and as we said earlier, the IO model assumes that we can simply go out and buy those assets and skills, those resources, on the open market. And then once we have all those things in place, we can go and implement our strategy, so make our strategy happen, and hopefully, if we're successful, achieve superior returns. So again, that IO model, that model of external analysis, really does shape the way we think about the external part of the input process into strategy formulation. What we're going to do in the next part of the lecture is we're going to look at the actual process of environmental scanning and analysis and talk through how an organisation might make a determination about which external factors have the greatest impact on their strategy.